Christmas used to mean safety to me. Not joy, not excitement, safety. The kind that comes from routine, from knowing where you're expected to sit, what you're expected to smile at, and how long you're allowed to speak before someone changes the subject. By the time you reach your 40s, you stop romanticizing holidays. You start surviving them. That year, Christmas was at my in-laws' house. Again. My father-in-law loved hosting. He loved control even more. Big house, perfectly arranged table. Everything polished enough to look warm, but never comfortable. He liked things done his way, and everyone knew it. My husband barely spoke during the drive there. He never did before family gatherings. His jaw stayed tight, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too hard. I asked him once, gently, if everything was okay. He smiled without looking at me. Yeah, just tired. That word again. Tired. It's amazing how often people use that word when they're hiding something. The house was already full when we arrived. Laughter spilled out the door, loud and practiced. My mother-in-law hugged me tightly, like she always did when she felt guilty about something she wasn't ready to admit. My father-in-law barely acknowledged me. He never had. To him, I was an accessory, the woman his son married, not the woman who noticed everything. Dinner was elaborate, heavy, traditional. Ham, roast potatoes, too many side dishes no one really wanted but everyone pretended to love. Conversation stayed shallow. Weather, work, complaints disguised as jokes. And then my father-in-law stood up. He tapped his glass with a spoon, smiling like a man about to make an announcement he'd rehearsed. "I want to introduce someone special," he said. I felt it before I understood it, that tightening in your chest, that sudden awareness that something is about to go very wrong. My husband stiffened beside me. A young woman stepped forward, too young to be there, too confident to be a stranger. My father-in-law placed a hand on her shoulder. "This," he said, "is someone very important to our family." I looked at my husband. He didn't look back. The room went quiet, not shocked quiet, but anticipation quiet. That's when it hit me. Not confusion, recognition. I had seen her before. Not at family gatherings, not at holidays. In places my husband said he was working late. My father-in-law continued, voice smooth. "She's been a big part of my son's life." No one spoke. No one moved. I felt something strange settle over me. Not anger, clarity. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The late nights, the emotional distance, the sudden coldness that had nothing to do with stress. And the most painful part? They weren't ashamed. They thought this was acceptable. They thought I would cry, argue, cause a scene. They thought Christmas would protect them. I smiled. That seemed to confuse them. My father-in-law looked pleased with himself, like he'd just ripped off a bandage. My husband finally looked at me then. Fear flickered across his face, because he knew something they didn't. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Because while they believed they were revealing the truth, they had forgotten something. Something signed years ago. Something legal. Something very specific. They had forgotten about the prenup, and Christmas had just become the wrong place to test it. People always assume betrayal happens suddenly, like one explosive moment where everything falls apart at once. It doesn't. It happens quietly, in missed details. In changes so small you explain them away because the alternative feels worse. Long before that Christmas, something had been off. I just hadn't wanted to name it. My husband used to tell me everything. Not big things, little things. Office gossip, complaints about traffic, stories that didn't really matter but somehow made you feel included. Then those stories stopped. He still talked, but not to me. He'd come home late, loosen his tie, and say he was exhausted. He'd sit across from me at dinner and scroll through his phone like he was waiting for permission to leave the room. When I asked questions, he'd answer just enough to end the conversation. Work's been crazy. Deadlines. You know how it is. I did know how it was. I'd been married long enough to know the difference between stress and distance. Distance has a temperature, and his was cold. What I didn't realize at first was how involved his father was in all of it. My father-in-law had always believed marriage was a business arrangement. Loyalty to him wasn't emotional, it was strategic. He liked control, liked knowing where everyone stood. When we first got married, he'd insisted on a prenup. At the time, it felt awkward but harmless. He framed it as protection. Just in case, he said. My husband hadn't argued. I hadn't either. I signed it carefully, reading every line. That habit would matter later. Back then, my father-in-law would make comments that felt off but easy to ignore. Marriage is about roles, he'd say. Everyone needs to know their place. I thought he meant responsibility. I didn't realize he meant hierarchy. As my marriage grew quieter, his presence grew louder. He'd call my husband more often, invite him over without me, offer advice that sounded more like instructions. I wasn't paranoid, I was observant. I noticed how my husband repeated his father's phrases, how he started framing decisions like they weren't his. Dad thinks this makes sense. Dad says it's normal. Dad doesn't see the problem. At some point, I realized I wasn't married to one man. I was married into a system, and systems don't like resistance. The woman my father-in-law introduced at Christmas hadn't come out of nowhere. I'd seen her before. Once, months earlier, at a cafe near my husband's office. She'd been laughing too comfortably across from him. When I asked about it later, he said she was a colleague. The lie wasn't convincing, but I accepted it, because sometimes believing a lie feels safer than confronting the truth. What I didn't know then was that his father knew everything, not just about her, about the affair, about the lies, about how long it had been going on. And instead of stopping it, he'd facilitated it. He believed my husband deserved someone more suitable, someone younger, more adaptable, someone who wouldn't ask questions. The mistress fit neatly into his idea of control, and I was inconvenient. By Christmas, the plan was already in motion. They'd decided the reveal should be public, calculated. They thought humiliation would weaken me. They thought embarrassment would silence me, that I'd cry, leave, disappear quietly. That's what they expected. What they didn't expect was how prepared I was, not emotionally, legally. The prenup my father-in-law had insisted on, it wasn't written in my husband's favor the way they assumed. I'd negotiated clauses, quiet ones, specific ones, infidelity clauses, disclosure clauses, clauses that didn't forgive betrayal just because it was convenient. At the time, my father-in-law had smirked. Fair is fair, he'd said. He thought fairness favored him. What none of them understood was that I hadn't signed that document blindly. I'd signed it knowing one thing. People who demand control usually underestimate the people who stay calm. That Christmas dinner wasn't a surprise attack. It was a miscalculation. And while they were watching my face, waiting for tears, I was remembering every line I'd read years earlier, every sentence they'd forgotten. I wasn't quiet because I was weak. I was quiet because timing matters, and Christmas wasn't over yet. No one spoke after my father-in-law finished his introduction, not because they were shocked, but because they were waiting for me. I could feel it, the pause, the attention, the quiet calculation in the room. Everyone was watching to see how I'd react. Tears were expected. Anger would have been convenient. A scene would have made the story cleaner for them. But I did none of that. I smiled. Not a big smile, just enough to make my father-in-law hesitate. Well, he said, clearing his throat, we thought it was time to be honest. Honest. That word landed like a joke. The young woman, his mistress, stood there awkwardly, her confidence flickering now that the moment had stretched longer than planned. She hadn't expected silence. She'd expected fireworks. My husband finally spoke. "Can we talk about this later?" he asked, his voice low, almost pleading. Later. My father-in-law waved him off. "No," he said. "This is family. It's better to handle it now." I looked around the table. No one defended me. No one objected. They weren't cruel. They were complicit. I stood slowly, placing my napkin on the table with deliberate care. I didn't rush. Rushing would have looked emotional. "I appreciate the honesty," I said calmly. My husband stared at me, confused. The room shifted. That wasn't the reaction they'd planned for. "I do have one question," I continued, turning to my father-in-law. "Why now?" He smiled, satisfied with himself. "Because we're moving forward," he said. "It's better if everyone understands the situation." Translation: accept it. I nodded. "That makes sense," I said. "Clarity is important." That word again. Clarity. The mistress relaxed slightly, misreading the moment. She thought she'd won something. I picked up my glass and took a small sip of water. Not because I was thirsty, but because pauses make people nervous. "Before we do anything else," I said, "there's something we should probably address." My father-in-law raised an eyebrow. My husband stiffened. "What's that?" my father-in-law asked. I turned to my husband, meeting his eyes for the first time that night. "Did you tell her about the prenup?" Silence. Not awkward silence. Dangerous silence. The color drained from his face. My father-in-law laughed softly. "That old thing?" he said. "That's irrelevant now." Irrelevant. I almost smiled again. "You're sure?" I asked. His smile faltered, just slightly. "Of course," he said. "It's standard, protects assets, nothing more." I nodded slowly. "That's not how I remember it." My husband swallowed hard. The mistress shifted her weight, suddenly aware she didn't understand the rules of the game she'd stepped into. "I don't think this is the right time," my husband said. "It's the perfect time," I replied. Christmas lights flickered behind him, casting shadows across his face. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded document, not the full prenup, just one page. "I had a lawyer review this years ago," I said, placing it on the table, "for clarity." My father-in-law leaned forward, squinting. His confidence slipped. "Infidelity clause," I read aloud calmly. "Any extramarital relationship voids specific protections and triggers financial consequences." The mistress froze. "What does that mean?" she asked. No one answered her. My husband looked at his father, panic creeping into his voice. "Dad?" My father-in-law grabbed the paper, scanning it quickly. His jaw tightened. "This is exaggerated," he snapped. "We can contest this." "You can try," I said evenly, "but it's airtight." He slammed the paper down. "This is Christmas," he said sharply. "You're embarrassing everyone." I tilted my head slightly. "No," I said. "You already did that." The room felt smaller, hotter. For the first time that evening, my father-in-law wasn't in control of the conversation. "You knew," my husband whispered. "Yes," I replied. "I always read what I sign." The mistress stepped back, her earlier confidence gone. "You didn't tell me any of this," she said to my husband. He didn't answer, because he couldn't. My father-in-law tried one last time to regain authority. "This doesn't change the situation," he said. "The relationship is over." "I agree," I said. "It is." I picked up my coat. "I'll be in touch with my attorney after the holidays," I added calmly. "I won't ruin Christmas for anyone." I paused, looking directly at the mistress. "But I wouldn't get too comfortable," I said softly. "This isn't the future you were promised." And with that, I walked out. Not angry, not broken, just finished. Christmas wasn't ruined. It was clarified. I didn't go home that night, not out of fear, out of clarity. I checked into a small hotel not far from the house. Nothing fancy, just quiet. I needed space where no one could knock on the door, pretending everything could still be fixed with a conversation. My phone started vibrating before I even took my coat off. Missed calls, voicemails, messages stacked on top of each other. From my husband. From my father-in-law. Even from my mother-in-law, whose silence during dinner had spoken louder than anything she could have said. I didn't listen to any of them. Not yet. People panic when control slips out of their hands. They reach for words they should have used earlier. I wasn't ready to hear rehearsed apologies. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, the messages changed. My husband's tone shifted from shock to desperation. "We need to talk. This got out of hand. Dad didn't mean it like that. You embarrassed us." Us, that word again. Still no acknowledgement of what he'd done, just damage control. My father-in-law's message was shorter, sharper. "We can handle this privately. There's no need to involve lawyers." That told me everything. If the prenup truly was irrelevant, he wouldn't be worried. I finally listened to one voicemail from my husband. His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. "I didn't think you'd do this," he said. "I didn't think you'd actually use it." Use it? Like protecting myself was some kind of betrayal. I called my attorney instead. Not dramatically, not angrily, just professionally. She already had the prenup on file. She'd reviewed it years earlier when I'd asked, just in case. She didn't sound surprised. "Given the circumstances," she said, "the clause applies exactly as written." Exactly. That word felt steady. By the end of the day, formal notices were drafted, not set yet, but ready. I let the holidays pass quietly. No public statements, no social media posts, no messy explanations. Silence works differently when it's chosen. Behind the scenes, things unraveled quickly. The mistress left town. Not because she suddenly found morals, because the future she'd been promised no longer existed. My father-in-law tried to salvage control by reframing the narrative. He told relatives it was a misunderstanding, that emotions had run high, that things were being worked out. But people talk, and Christmas had witnesses. My husband showed up at the hotel 2 days later. He looked older, smaller, like a man realizing the systems he relied on no longer protected him. "I never meant to hurt you," he said. I believed that, but intention doesn't erase impact. "You let them humiliate me," I replied calmly. "You planned it." He looked down. "They thought you'd stay quiet." "And you?" I asked. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. He begged. He apologized. He blamed his father. He blamed pressure. He blamed confusion. He never took responsibility, and that mattered. When the legal notice was finally sent, my father-in-law called immediately, angry this time. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he snapped. "This will damage the family." I smiled. "No," I said. "This revealed it." He threatened countersuits, public embarrassment, financial consequences. All noise. The document didn't care how loud he got. Weeks passed. Assets were frozen, accounts reviewed, terms enforced. The prenup did exactly what it was designed to do. It protected the person they assumed would never need protection. And slowly, painfully, my husband understood what he'd lost. Not just money, credibility, support. The version of himself that believed someone else would always clean up his mess. One evening, as I sat alone with a glass of wine, I realized something surprising. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns energy. Clarity conserves it. They'd thought silence meant weakness. They'd confused calm with compliance, and they'd chosen the wrong moment to test it. I didn't win. I simply stopped losing. There's a strange moment that comes after betrayal, when the truth is already out, but people are still deciding how to feel about it. That's when stories start forming, not facts. Stories. Some people needed me to be cruel. Others needed me to be dramatic. A few wanted me to be forgiving. Very few were comfortable with me being calm. Because calm doesn't fit neatly into anyone's narrative. Word spread quickly, the way it always does in families that pretend they don't gossip. Calls came from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. Messages that started with concern, but quickly turned into advice. You should think about the family. Christmas was already hard enough. He made a mistake. Don't destroy his future. It was fascinating how easily his betrayal became my responsibility. No one asked how it felt to be humiliated in front of a room full of people. No one questioned why his father thought that moment was appropriate. Instead, they wanted peace, and peace, apparently, required my silence. Again. My mother-in-law invited me for coffee a week later, neutral territory, public enough to keep emotions contained. She stirred her drink for a long time before speaking. "Your father-in-law didn't handle it well," she finally said. That was her version of accountability. But he was trying to protect his son. I nodded slowly. "And who was protecting me?" I asked. She didn't answer. She told me she hoped I wouldn't take things too far. That phrase stayed with me. Too far compared to what? Public humiliation? Deception? Betrayal planned like a performance? But consequences always feel extreme to people who never expected them. Friends reacted differently. Some surprised me. Some disappointed me. A few quietly admitted they'd suspected something but hadn't known how to say it. Others avoided me entirely, as if betrayal were contagious. That was fine. I was learning how little energy I had left for people who preferred comfort over honesty. My husband tried again weeks later. He showed up calmer this time, more composed. "I'm in therapy," he said. "I'm trying to understand why I let this happen." I believed him, but healing doesn't obligate reconciliation. "You didn't just let it happen," I replied. "You aligned with it." That distinction mattered. He asked if we could rebuild. I asked him what that looked like to him. He talked about time, counseling, boundaries. He didn't talk about trust. And without that, there was nothing to rebuild. The legal process continued quietly. The prenup held. My father-in-law's influence dissolved quickly once money and leverage were no longer on his side. It turns out authority isn't very impressive when it's unsupported. The mistress disappeared from the story almost entirely. No dramatic exit, no apology, just absence, which felt appropriate. She'd been part of a fantasy that collapsed under paperwork. What surprised me most wasn't how much changed, but how much didn't. The world didn't fall apart. Life went on. I woke up, I worked, I took long walks without checking my phone. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I started to recognize myself again. Not the woman who stayed quiet to keep peace, but the woman who paid attention, who read carefully, who trusted her instincts even when she didn't act on them right away. I realized something important. Strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like patience with an expiration date. People who benefit from your silence will always be shocked when it ends, and they will call it cruelty. I didn't correct them. I didn't owe anyone a better story than the truth. By the time spring arrived, the legal matters were nearly settled. The marriage was over, not with shouting, but with paperwork, which felt fitting. My father-in-law stopped calling. My husband stopped asking. The noise faded. What remained was quiet. Not the kind that erases you, the kind that belongs to you. For the first time in years, silence felt like a choice, and that made all the difference.